Hello, everyone. Hi, and thanks for coming to our special event today. My name is Brendan Stone, and I'm the co-chair of the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. And never have we needed this organization as much as we do today. So the title of our event today is Connecting the Dots. And that's what we're doing. We're showing the linkages between struggles in West Asia and between those and the war in Ukraine. And the fact that I'm using the words West Asia instead of Middle East shows the new world that we are entering. The term Middle East is made in reference to Great Britain, in that the Middle East is between England and the so-called Far East. But those terms, the terms of reference used by European colonialists, are no longer preeminent. First, there was a period of decolonization, and now the United States hegemony that had taken over from colonialism is also starting to fall apart. And for those who are still trickling in, I was just saying, my name's Brendan. I'm with the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, and we have a great event for you coming up. There's going to be a question period afterwards and chat, and I'll explain that in a moment. But this falling apart of hegemony is what this webinar is about today. The wars and conflict and instabilities we see in Europe and West Asia are happening because the United States wants to retain control, while others are challenging that control and asserting sovereignty. And so this effort to keep something that is dying is now endangering every human being on Earth. Now, in order that we can have rallies, protests, book launches, and webinars, we do need your support. So if you want to donate and support the activities of the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, you can click on the Donate tab on our website, hcsw.ca, or send an e-transfer to hcsw@cogeco.ca. And there's very important things regarding fundraising for Syria that you're going to be hearing about. Now, people might not know what US hegemony is. They might not understand all of the linkages between conflicts, might not be familiar with who is resisting what, but that's what our panel is here for. They're going to place Palestine, Yemen, Ukraine, and so on in their proper context. And it looks like there'll be a special focus on Syria today. So let me just tell you what's coming up now and how things are organized. First, our distinguished panelists are going to speak. Subsequently, Paul LaRudy is going to explain what we can do to help Syria. The chat right now is disabled for most people, but it will be re-enabled when question period starts. You'll notice there's a Q&A tab or Q&A button, questions and answer, that should be in your Zoom program. You can start submitting questions at any time, especially during question period, and I will end up reading those questions to the panel during question period. So formulate your questions, put them in the Q&A. You might be able to get them through via chat later on. That will be opened up. So that's what we all came for. So we want to get to the panel now. Now, you might notice that there's words appearing on the screen, maybe right below my face. And we have captions turned on. These are closed captioning. They're automated, so they won't be completely accurate, but you can control them using the CC Live Transcript button on your Zoom control panel. And the webinar itself is being recorded. So I want to thank our co-sponsors in the Syria support movement, as well as Sanctions Kill, the International Manifesto Group, and the Geopolitical Economy Research Group. Thank you so much for making this event possible. It would not be what it is without your support and technical assistance and sending this to your networks. So what I want to do first is go over to our first panelist, Rick Sterling, and he's given me a brief introduction, and he says, Rick Sterling is an independent analyst and journalist, and his articles appear in numerous publications concerning international geopolitics, international sports, and other topics, including Syria, solidarity, and support. And you can find those at numerous websites. So thank you very much, Rick, for being with us. Let's go over to Rick Sterling.
Thanks very much, Brendan. It's a pleasure to be here. Very important topic. And for today, I've written a special paper. It's called Syria, Ukraine, and the New American Century. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990, influential neoconservatives said it was time to flex the U.S. muscle and ensure that U.S. interests and priorities were dominant. This was to be the new American century with no challengers. They said it explicitly: the U.S. must not permit any country to again be able to challenge U.S. supremacy and dominance. With the Soviet Union gone and Russia in disarray, there was no counterforce in international organizations or the United Nations. The U.S. manipulated existing agencies and created new institutions to its advantage. History and international agreements were rewritten. For example, with U.S. and Israeli pressure, the UN resolution affirming that Zionism is racism was overturned. Sanctions on Iraq, aimed to drive the country into total submission, led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands. Children were especially vulnerable to sickness from contaminated water. Chlorine for the purification of water was prohibited, while the U.S. hailed itself as a leader in gender equality with the first female Secretary of State. Recalcitrant countries were subject to attack. The multi-ethnic country of Yugoslavia was a prime target. Divisions were promoted, while the CIA funded an extremist separatist army. NATO went on the attack, bombing Serbia without authorization from the UN Security Council. Divide and conquer. Simultaneously, the creation of the European Union in 1993 made it harder for individual countries to act in their own best interests and easier for the US to dominate the whole. The military alliance binding them together is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Although this is a military alliance, there is no doubt which country is paramount. The US spends more than all the others combined. The violation of international law continued and escalated with the invasion of Iraq in 2003 by the US and a quote-unquote coalition of the willing. The country was devastated, extremism and sectarianism exploded. US troops remain there today, despite the Iraqi parliament and government requesting they leave. Despite promises from US intelligence agencies, Iraq's military did not have weapons of mass destruction. It was the US with weapons of mass deception. As for chemical weapons, they now exist in the form of dust, which comes from depleted uranium bullets and hardware that vaporized and mixed with the environment. Iraq has had a huge increase in the birth of deformed babies, which continues to today. While this was happening, Russia was starting to restabilize. After a decade of chaos, corruption, and the collapse of the communist safety net, Russia was getting back on its feet. The standard of living and life expectancy started to increase. Western advisors were no longer in charge. Oligarchs were no longer able to rob at will. Even though the Warsaw Pact has ceased to exist, NATO refused to disband. On the contrary, despite promises to Russian leaders, NATO expanded in 1999, 2004, and 2009. The US and NATO allies were simultaneously conducting more and more offensive military actions. First in Yugoslavia in 1997, then Afghanistan 2001, then in Iraq in 2003. When NATO invited Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO in 2008, Russia said that would cross their red line. NATO was clearly an offensive alliance, and to permit it on the Ukrainian border less than 500 miles from Moscow would jeopardize Russian security. Russia kept asking that the security for all countries be considered. In early 2011, in the midst of the Arab Spring, unrest in Libya erupted. Western media started propagating stories of pending massacres, and the UN Security Council, with China and Russia abstaining, authorized a no-fly zone and quote-unquote necessary measures to protect civilians. This became the pretext for the US plus NATO and other allies to attack Libyan government forces, overthrowing the Libyan government and unleashing a civil war that continues to today. Later evidence revealed that the sensational claims of rape and pending massacre were falsehoods, just like in the past. At the same time, the West and allies Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey were funding, training, and supporting extremists and foreigners traveling to Syria. After the overthrow of the Libyan government, the CIA took control of Libyan military arsenals and started sending weapons to jihadists in Syria. Extremists were trained in camps in Turkey on the Syrian border. Turkey, of course, is a longtime NATO member. Weapons were flown into a U.S. airbase in Turkey. Thus started the U.S. war on Syria, which continues to today. In the fall of 2013, while the West claimed that Syria had killed hundreds of civilians with chemical weapons, neocons were itching to attack Syria as they had attacked Libya. Russia persuaded Syria to give up all their chemical weapons, which had been developed as a deterrent against Israel's nuclear weapons. Later, Seymour Hersh revealed that the chemical attacks were not carried out by the Syrian government. They were excuse me, it just got a little bit lost here. Revealed that the chemical attacks were not carried out by the Syrian government. Rather, they had been perpetrated by extremists with Turkish support. The purpose, to provide a pretext for US and NATO direct attacks on Syria. Meanwhile, 1,200 miles north of Damascus, protests in the main square of the capital of Ukraine were growing in intensity. As in Syria, there was a combination of peaceful protesters and a small but violent faction of ultranationalist extremists. Organizations funded by Western billionaires and US agencies were pivotal in the Ukraine protests. US politicians and officials such as Victoria Nuland and John McCain showed up to offer support. According to the acting president of the US Chamber of Commerce in Kiev, the US embassy was crawling with CIA officers. On February 7, 2014, Victoria Nuland and the US ambassador discussed who would take leadership and who would be outside after the pending Ukraine coup. Nuland summed it up as Yats is the guy, that is Arseniy Yatsenyuk. With the Winter Olympics in Sochi, Russia drawing to a close, someone decided to expedite the coup. Timing is important. On February 20, snipers killed over 50 protesters and police to ignite the events. Professor Ketchanovsky of University of Ottawa has rigorously researched the events and convincingly proves that the shootings were done by snipers located in opposition-controlled buildings. On the first day of the coup government, on 27 February, they removed Russian as an official language, despite 30% of the population having it as a first language. It would be comparable to a coup in Ottawa, Canada, with the coup government removing French as an official language of Canada. The new leader was the same Arseniy Yatsenyuk that had been planned by Nuland weeks earlier. Opponents of the coup government were attacked with 42 killed in Odessa. In Crimea, they quickly organized a referendum on whether to secede from Ukraine. With 83% turnout, 97% of the population said they wanted to join the Russian Federation. In eastern Ukraine, north of Crimea, called the Donbass, there was also a majority of the population deeply opposed to the coup and coup government. They confronted the authorities, and many military units defected to join the secessionists. The reasons were cut off by the Kiev government, with pensioners no longer receiving retirement checks and teachers not being paid. The regions were excluded from national elections. Eventually, they organized themselves as the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. Thus, the war in Ukraine began 9 years ago in February 2014, not just 1 year ago. The cause of the war is foreign intervention, primarily by the USA. Western neocons were not satisfied with a mixed Ukraine. They wanted it to be an anti-Russian force. Thus, Victoria Nuland, in the famous secretly recorded conversation, said, "Fuck the EU." She was referring to the compromise agreement that some European leaders preferred. In late 2014 and again in 2015, peace agreements to resolve the civil war in Ukraine were signed in Minsk. France and Germany were to help ensure the implementation. Russia supported this as a way to resolve the conflict. The UN Security Council passed a resolution in support of it. Instead of implementing this, Kiev ignored the promises, and the US and NATO began arming and training the Ukraine army. In effect, Ukraine became a non-member of NATO. The arming and NATOization continued and escalated. First, it was only defensive weapons. Then, under Trump, they began supplying offensive weapons. NATO plans to destabilize and weaken Russia were explicit. The RAND Corporation published reports discussing the strategic options. The long-term goal to weaken and destabilize Russia. The longer-term goal to break it up. Meanwhile, in Syria, the NATO-supported war on the Damascus government continued. In late 2014 and early 2015, major assaults by ISIS and the Syrian version of al-Qaeda took place. Syrian and foreign extremists poured across the Turkish border. There were dozens of Canadians, hundreds of Brits, thousands of Europeans and North Africans. They had been propagandized by fanatical sectarians in mosques created by Saudi Arabia or Qatar. With weapons and training from Western military intelligence forces, they were able to capture a large area of northern Syria and even threaten Damascus. An overthrow of the Syrian government and creation of chaos like in Libya were preferable to the West, which saw Syria as an ally of Russia, and to Israel, which saw Syria as a steadfast supporter of Palestine and opponent to their control of the Golan Heights. In September 2015, Russia came to the assistance of the Damascus government. They provided airplanes and pilots to attack the advancing extremists. Uninvited, the US began overflying Syria and then establishing US bases in the east and the south. They rarely attacked ISIS, but attacked Syrian troops at critical times. Then they began cultivating Kurdish secessionist elements. They rebranded them as the quote-unquote Syrian Democratic Forces. They're still there, stealing the nation's wealth in oil and wheat. At the same time, the US has imposed draconian sanctions to make it vastly harder for Syria to rebuild infrastructure. US sanctions aim to prevent any investment in Syria. Little by little, Syria is recovering, but the US still controls a large area in the northeast and the south. The northern province of Idlib is controlled by the Syrian version of al-Qaeda. The dirty war on Syria, fomented and promoted by the US and allies, continues. It has recently been revealed by the former Ukrainian, French, and German leaders that the 2015 Minsk peace agreement was always a ruse. By their own statements and admissions, it was never a genuine effort to peacefully resolve the civil war in eastern Ukraine. The goal was to stall for time while NATO trained and equipped the Ukrainian army to solidify the anti-Russian attitude and to crush those not in agreement. 1 year ago, Russian troops went into Ukraine with the stated goal of denazifying and demilitarizing the country. Ukrainian civilians have fled the fighting, with more than 3 million going to Russia. Did Russia have a choice? They could have continued waiting, hoping for a change in attitude by the US and NATO. They tried. In December 2021, Russia proposed peace treaties with the US and NATO. Instead of negotiating, the US and NATO dismissed the proposals out of hand. In summary, US-led NATO and the West has overthrown sovereign governments in Iraq and Libya. They continue to try to topple others in Iran and Venezuela. They continue to support the Israeli occupation of Palestine. They have imposed cruel sanctions on about 40 countries. After 30 years of NATO aggression and escalating threats, Russia acted. There is widespread understanding and support for their position in the global south. 85% of the world's population is in governments which either support Russia or abstain in the votes of condemnation. What happens in Ukraine will have a profound effect on the struggles in Syria, Palestine, Iran, and beyond. The new American century, dreamed by US hawks, has been challenged directly. It is high time to end the US delusions of superiority and exceptionalism. We need a multipolar world with respect for the UN Charter and international law. That means disband NATO. Let the people in Crimea and the Donbass choose their own destinies. Let the war end. Ukrainians recover and prosper in an independent country, which is neither a tool of the US, or Russia. Let the people of Syria, Iran, Palestine, Lebanon, Yemen, and all countries live in peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick, for that valuable background. And it actually has prompted a couple of questions. People are saying that a lot of valuable information is being presented, and they want to know if they can store that for later. I don't know a lot about it, but it's my understanding if you go to the CC, the closed captioning section, captions and all of that, I think you can click on it or right click on it or click on the little arrow, and there's a drop down menu. And one of the options is something to do with saving a transcript of the closed captioning. So if that's at all possible on people's computers, I welcome you to do that and go ahead and save the closed captioning. There was also another question, or a couple questions from audience members. We have a very feisty audience, and they're already submitting a lot of things to the Q&A panel. Some people were wondering if they can be seen, if their video can be seen by the panelists, or if they can control audio and video. This is a webinar, so it's a bit different than the usual Zoom meetings. We have to focus on our panelists because we've got 3 or 4 people up there and some other people. And so you'll be able to engage more with each other once we start the question period, because once question period starts, we will open up the chat. And of course, I know everyone is from all over and they want to indicate where they're from and what organizations they're with and what they're doing and what anti-war events are coming up and so forth. And so it'll be like the February 19 meeting. And so we will open up the chat for everyone to do that once the initial presentations have gone forward. So thanks again, Rick. And I believe, yes, our next person coming up shortly is going to be Marwa Osman. And of course, Marwa Osman, PhD, is assistant professor at the Lebanese International and Maref universities. And she produces and presents the Media Stream on Press TV. She's international affairs advisor to the Secretary General of the Global Gathering in support of the choice of resistance, and she's a mother of 3. So Marwa, thanks everyone. Thanks to everyone. So grateful that you can be here today, and we'll put you right on. Marwa Osman.
Thank you very much, Brendan, and thank you to everyone who has found the time to be with us and to register for this very important webinar. And I want to thank Rick for the amazing brief that he gave us about the Western hegemony in the region, specifically in Eastern Europe and right here in West Asia. And I would like to begin by giving out my condolences to my brothers and sisters in Syria for the catastrophe that befell upon them on February 6th with the major earthquake after more than 12 years of constant US war with the help of 82 countries from across the world. And I would also like to extend my condolences to my Palestinian brothers and sisters for the Nablus massacre that was committed by the Zionist entity this past week that resulted in multiple deaths and many injured. And we are with you in every way possible, and we believe in the liberation of Palestine soon, inshallah. Now, what I want to talk about today is basically Syria and the sanctions on Syria, and how the US announcement of it lifting the sanctions is a big lie, as usual. But why it's a lie and how the sanctions have been affecting the Syrian people over the course of 13 years. And now, after the biggest natural disaster that hit Syria and more, actually that hit the Levant in more than 100 years, but Syria in specific that is suffering already, how those sanctions are also hindering the relief and aid that Syria very much needs. Let me begin by saying that the sanctions on Syria are called sanctions in the dictionary of the US foreign policy, but they are actually illegal, unilateral, punitive measures against a nation that decided to resist occupation, resist aggression, eliminate takfiri terrorism that was sponsored by sadly, some of the Arab regimes in the region, also with the direct demand and guidelines of the United States of America, obviously with the usual perpetrators, the UK and the rest of the European Union. Obviously, for the interest basically of the Zionist entity in our region. So these unilateral punitive measures have been working to break down the economic system, the health sector, the education system, and most importantly, the level of coordination between the governmental institutions inside of Syria under the pretext that this is actually helping the people of Syria to oust the government that they don't want, despite the fact that they elected that government and despite the fact that they also re-elected their president with a very high percentile, given the fact that more than 9 million have been displaced and are refugees across the world and across our region. Now, these sanctions have two sides for them. They have the accumulative side and they have the present after earthquake side. Let me try and explain what has been happening inside Syria over the past 13 years. Just to clarify that the impact of these US and Western sanctions in obstructing the rapid response to the repercussions of the recent earthquake, because a lot of people are saying that the government is to be blamed for this very slow reply or slow response to the earthquake. That's a lie, because it's the government is actually doing the best it can, and I'll explain shortly why. But it can be actually identified into two reasons. Firstly, as I said, is the cumulative effect of these ongoing sanctions since the beginning of the global war on Syria in 2011, which hindered some of the efforts of the government. Basically, it even hindered them from getting to afflicted areas, because ambulances couldn't get actually to certain areas that were affected by the earthquake because of the sanctions that did not allow the reconstruction of the areas that were previously hit by the war. So sanctions played a big role in not allowing the government to reconstruct, to rebuild, hence made it nearly impossible to get to the people on time, especially people who were still alive under the rubble. This cumulative effect was evident in three main aspects, mainly the direct sanctions that were happening ever since even before the Caesars Act that was imposed by the Trump administration. Before that, by the Obama administration, there was the direct sanctions on the energy, the construction, and the reconstruction sectors in Syria. Also on the banking system in Syria, which is why the lie of the US lifting these sanctions is obvious. You can't wire money from your bank account into any bank inside Syria, because that latest, I think 8 days after the earthquake, when the US decided to lift it for 180 days, lift those sanctions, you see that there's an exemption for one part. One part will not be, this lifting of sanctions will not be applied to one part of the sanctions, which is basically the banks of Syria. And why is that? Because like every other country, the banks in Syria are actually connected directly to the central bank. Just like banks in America, for example, they are directly connected to the Federal Reserve. Banks in Syria are connected to the central bank and the country, and the central bank is heavily sanctioned by the US Treasury because it is more or less unwilling to be part of the Federal Reserve. Syria is unwilling to be connected to the United States of America with all the funds that it has as a government. So by default, the banks are sanctioned. So you can't wire money even after lifting the sanctions. So you can't help the people you know, or even the people that you don't know, but you think that need the help. That's part of the accumulated sanctions. And then also by not allowing Syria to sell its energy resources, to sell oil or gas, you are not allowing it to make profit, to properly operate its governmental institutions. For example, by not allowing other countries or any companies to buy oil from Syria, the oil that is already under the Syrian control, because we'll talk later on about the oil that is under the US control. They're basically in the biggest oil fields in Syria in the eastern part of the Euphrates, which is the Conoco oil field and the Al Omar oil field. US occupation soldiers sitting there protecting the oil, yes, looting the oil through the areas that are controlled by the allies of the Americans in the region, specifically in the northeastern part of Syria, where the Kurdish separatists are, and looting also and taking them across the border to Iraq, where also the US has some sort of control over some areas where they can sell this oil, which belongs to the Syrian people. Sanctioning the energy sector does not only affect selling oil in Syria, it also affects the health sector in Syria. It affects the education sector in Syria. How does that happen? Imagine yourself being sick and then going to a specialist, and that specialist says you need to go to the hospital. And when you are, and you need a surgery or operation, and you are under surgery, and then suddenly there's no electricity. I have seen firsthand in my own eyes surgeries being performed in Syria using the flashlights of mobile phones because there was no electricity, because there was no enough fuel to get to these hospitals to operate. And generators cost a lot of money. And if generators are there to buy fuel, it's like buying something very rare in Syria. You have queues and queues of people on gas stations to try and find gas, to try and fill up their tanks to go to work. Also, it affects the education system. How? Because if you want to go to school, you have to take the bus. And if there's no diesel fuel for the bus or there's no gasoline for the bus, you can't go to school. Hence why the level of illiteracy has been elevating inside of Syria. Same for the universities. And if you think about any sector, you need transportation, and that is unviable. At certain points before the earthquake, Syria was shutting down for weeks unending. Shutting down meaning people not being able to go to work because at a certain point there was no more gasoline for the people, which is why we saw help coming from Iraq and Iran through the only open border between those countries, the border that was basically liberated by the Syrian Arab Army with the help of its allies on both sides, whether in Iraq, the PMU, or in Lebanon, the Hezbollah and the National Liberation Forces in Syria. We saw convoys of oil getting to Syria after more than 2 weeks of shutting down country, no one going anywhere because they can't go anywhere anymore. More than 21 big trucks that were getting these fuel into Syria were bombed right there on the border, because according to the US, that's breaking the sanctions and you will die if you break the sanctions. 5 people lost their lives because they were bombed by that, by the drones that were sent by the Americans, which, by the way, the Americans never admitted to, but the Israelis actually issued a statement at that point saying it was not us. We didn't bomb that convoy, and hence the oil didn't get there. And other times, the Islamic Republic of Iran was trying to get oil to Syria and gasoline to Syria through the Mediterranean, and the shipments were stopped, were pirated by the either the US or by puppet regimes in Europe that operate under the hands of the US. Then you have the sanctions that hit the exchange rate in Syria. And we're talking at the level of the people, because sanctions are killing the people, and they have been killing the people since the beginning of the war, not only now, as I've explained in the health sector and the education sector and otherwise. But now in the lira, and the Syrian lira, and the exchange rate of the Syrian lira decreased significantly during the years because of the US blockade on the country. I'll give you an example. Back in 2018, $1 equaled 450 Syrian lira. Today, it's more than 6,800 Syrian liras. 2018, almost 500. Today, 6,800 to the dollar. And meanwhile, the salaries are still the same. So you can imagine the level of devastation, the level of poverty that these sanctions have put the direct Syrian population in. This decline left direct and indirect effects on the country's ability to secure the need of food, medicine, oil derivatives, technical equipment, medical equipment, you name it, because when you don't have enough money to buy it, you're going to sit without it. The third effect is the high cost of importing goods and importing material due to the high risk of dealing with Syria. The US is a gang. They deal with other countries and companies as if they are there to kill them. You either operate the way we say, or you die. You die meaning we finish you. We don't allow you to operate in the economy. We don't allow you to take the loans, for example, that you need if you're a country trying to break those sanctions. The level of fear that the US was able to input in other states, entities, and companies made it near impossible for those entities, those states, and those companies to actually even have agreements with Syria, even have economic ties with Syria, even send aid to Syria, and that's before the earthquake. After the second, after the actual impact of the earthquake, we saw that there was a reluctance of most international companies in many disciplines and sectors to cooperate and deal with the Syrian government and with the private institutions. At a personal level, I try to communicate with many NGOs in Lebanon that I actually trust, NGOs that are not funded by the USAID and the FDD and whatnot, but NGOs that I trust that can help. I tried to talk to them. I said, how about you guys let us share your like IBN account numbers in the banks so the people can wire you the money in Lebanon, and you guys take that money to Syria, and no one would dare accept, despite the fact that they are direct allies with Syria, because they were afraid to be affected by the US sanctions and have their accounts banned or shut down. And then they wouldn't even be able to help the Lebanese people where we live right now. And it's a very, very critical financial and economic situation in Lebanon. So that's an example. So you always need a third party in order to work with Syria. And that third party is always under risk of sanctions from the United States of America and the European Union. Unfortunately, this network of fear has reached companies and institutions and countries that also support Syria politically. What does that mean? It means that more costs, more expenses, living and health crises in Syria are increasing, and the Syrians are forced to bear all of this despite the already difficult economic conditions that they are going through. Now, the governments are afraid of economic cooperation, and they are afraid of sending relief aid to Syria. For example, even after removing the so-called sanctions for 180 days, which, by the way, the US always said they never affected the country, they only affected the government, then why did you go ahead and 8 days after the earthquake lift those sanctions for 180 days? Never mind. Even after that announcement, you had, up until now, European countries that were sending aid to Lebanon instead of sending them to Syria. We just had 3 days ago the first German plane to land in Syria for the first time in 13 years. But right after the earthquake, we had, for example, Italy was the first country that sent aid to Syria via Lebanon, but unloading the aid in Lebanon would take 3 to 4 hours. And then taking them by land to, for example, Aleppo would take at least 8 hours. And then getting them to the people who need them will take another 2 hours. These are hours that are going out of the lives of the people of Syria. People died because not enough aid was able to get there to get them out of the rubble. We're talking about humans just like you and me who are not able to move from under the rubble because there was not enough machinery, because the US has been sanctioning Syria for 13 years that wouldn't allow them to buy the machine that they need, even though they have the money to do so. Now, despite the seriousness of this long negative effect and impact on Western sanctions on the Syrian economy, the lifting of these sanctions can actually, the real lifting, not the US hawks of lifting in the media, the real lifting of these sanctions can contribute within a short period of time, I'm very sure of it, to achieve at least positive results that will have an impact on the lives and the livelihood of the population, such as quickly and remotely restoring some of the country's needs for commodities and very essential needs, especially in the health and the food sectors inside Syria. I hope to have been able to paint a picture of how very, very bad the situation inside Syria is right now. And please mind you that the media is not showing you the aftermath and the aftershocks of the earthquakes. We didn't have one earthquake. We had one major earthquake on February 6th, which the entire region felt, which led to the devastation. We had another one that was also near 7, it was 6 point something, and more buildings collapsed in Syria, especially Aleppo, Latakia, Jable, and Hama. And then you had aftershocks that now the buildings that actually survived the first 2 major ones are no longer capable of housing humans. People have to leave their houses because at any moment, any small earthquake would lead to that house collapsing on their head. So it's a displacement inside of a displacement. People who have been displaced 3 times in Syria have lost their houses or died under the rubble. And despite that, the US and Europe, they decide not to lift the sanctions, decide not to help the Syrian people. But on the other hand, you see all the help that the Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, is getting in the northern part of Syria by international communities, by international NGOs, millions of dollars funneled again into the hands of the terrorists known as the White Helmets. You can learn a lot about them if you just Google a bit about them. Our friend Vanessa Bili has written extensively about the White Helmets and where they get their money from and who they are and how they are actually the same Nusra fighters that have terrorized the Syrian public. More money is being funneled because the US is counting on energizing the war inside of Syria. The people in Syria cannot take it anymore, trust me. They have been through hell and back. And despite that, just 12 days after the earthquake, you see the United States of America, this puppet, the Zionist entity, bombing Damascus, bombing residential areas in Damascus. What nation on earth has actually endured what Syria has in the past 11 or 12 years? Added to that, continuous aggression against the Palestinians that I would like only to remind you of on a daily basis. This region needs your support by stopping the warmongering psychopaths from trying to loot our resources by taking our lives first. Thank you for listening, and I hope you got to understand the dire situation that Syria is passing through. Syria needs you, it needs your support. Find the right people to help Syria, it needs it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marwa. I think I see some of our panelists clapping, which was not part of the program, but thank you, Rick and others. It's very special to be able to speak with Marwa because of the time difference. It's not easy to speak with her in North America, and she's very busy with many programs and shows. So we're very grateful that she's here. And it's terrible how difficult it is to get aid into all of Syria, and how Lebanon is affected by political issues as well, preventing aid. Of course, not too long from now, not immediately, but soon, Paul Larudi, he'll be telling you what you can do to help Syria, and that's very, very important. Just with regard to the previous speaker as well, Rick, he seems to have set off a great deal of questions in the Q&A box. People were enormously interested in his talk. And in the article that he made reference to, and in the books that he made reference to. So I'm just going to make a note because I heard from Rick in the chat, and that is the article he was referring to is an article that he has been writing specially for this event, for this weekend of action and to deal with these issues. So I don't think it's been published quite yet, but it will be. And when it is, we will send it out to our mailing list. We will make it available along with the video of this event. So you will be able to read the article that Rick Sterling is referring to. And we'll also get the information about the books that were being used. We'll try to get a transcript of his speech and so forth. So as I said, there's enormous interest in that, and we'll try to get that, as much of that information to you as possible. But speaking of interest and understanding and information, I know we have coming up shortly, Professor Atif Kuborsi. I believe Atif, he's going to want to weave a lot of this together: Palestine, Yemen, Syria, look at the broader understandings of all of this, as some of our panelists have alluded to. So we're going to be going over to Dr. Atif Kuborsi, who is the president of Econometric Research Limited, which he founded in 1972. He is also Emeritus Professor of Economics at McMaster University and served as Undersecretary General of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, 2006 to 2008. He is the author of many books and many hundreds of scholarly articles. So let's give it up and let's welcome Professor Atif Kuborsi.
Thank you very much, Brendan, for this generous introduction. My argument is very simple. This is not a war in Europe. This is a global war by any standards, and there isn't a single region that has been spared. And the consequences are extremely dire, but particularly for Western Asia, as I will agree with you. The manifestation of this global war is in economics, and we all know there isn't one here among us that has not been to the pump and has paid a lot more for the gas. Nobody has gone to a grocery store and did not pay more for the food. And there is a lot of us who are waiting for cars that cannot be produced because quite a bit of the metals that come, like palladium, titanium, and others in the catalytic converters that come from either Russia or Ukraine and now are not available. And the inflation that we are facing is incredibly unusual in the sense that given the background where it was almost zero and even 2% was not even the real one, the actual real inflation was literally close to zero. And interest rates that were 0.25%, literally zero. In real terms, when you factor inflation, they were negative. And now we're really paying very high interest rates. Everybody is paying high interest rate. And the way we're trying to fight this inflation as the war is going on is a class war, in the sense that we're trying to engineer a recession. Who would bear the brunt of this recession? Is going to be the working class, the middle class, the people on fixed income, people who cannot and do not have the market power to adjust their income to reflect the cost of living that they're going. The war has brought uncertainty. There is nothing more costly in economics than uncertainty. Uncertainty is the nemesis of investment. Uncertainty is basically undermining the capacity of many countries, Syria and every place, to mount the economic and productive and viable investments that they need for their people and the new generation. There is an rearrangement of trade. We have, COVID came in and disrupted the supply chains, but the war has really exacerbated that in a way that has not really been expected or could have really been dealt with, or is the ability of people to adjust to it. But the real issue here is that the way we're fighting inflation is a class war. It's a war that will be paid for by the poor people, by the poor country, the global South, that is absolutely and totally indebted. The indebtedness in Egypt is now a high rate that has never been experienced. In Lebanon, as you all know, the economy collapsed under the weight of the debt. And then Marwa is talking about the effects of the war and the collapse of the economy and American hegemony, an American attempt. The economic situation collapse in Lebanon and Syria, people are hungry, is not by coincidence. I would submit here that is really a truly designed objective of the hegemon, who's trying basically to rearrange the region and to bring back American dominance into this region by making people hungry, by exacting a collective punishment on the poor people. The Lebanese pound used to be 1,500 aid to the dollar. Now, today is 80,000. And as she mentioned, the trouble with all this, and we're saving, saving this, we're experiencing this here, the wages do not match the increases in the cost of living. So poor people are getting poorer. And the poor people of Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Yemen, and others who are really paying the price for American hegemony and their attempt to unravel their social and economic and political systems are exacting a very high price. I want to argue too that the manifestation of this war are racial. We all heard that people who came up and said, hey, wait a minute, these are not the Iraqis. These are blue-eyed blondes like us. To a great extent, this war has blew the cover over racism, legitimized in a way racism. And in a way, I would argue what Rick was really talking about too, is that it has given license to fascist right-wing groups. The Americans don't care who support them as long as they support them. They have really went with groups in Ukraine that absolutely, totally, overtly fascist and Nazis. And in some sense, I'm arguing that the right-wing government in Israel could not have really come at the time if the Americans and the West have really been true to their obligation to protect democracies. They allowed the most fascist and most vicious and most repressive regime to come about and is exacting very heavy price on the Palestinians in a way that despite all the sacrifices and all the costs they have paid in the past, today is a completely true situation of bleeding where the young people are being massacred, and there are campaigns that are basically going in a rampage into civilian areas, not paying any attention. Under international law, the occupiers are obligated to protect those who are under their occupation. Israel has flaunted the international law and moral law, but what is really absolutely disheartening, and I attribute it to a great extent to the war and to the American attempt to create support for this war, disregarding every other moral imperative, is because basically the Israelis get with it without a whimper, without any parallel, any restraint, any criticism. People are being killed on daily basis. These fantastic journalists killed by an Israeli bullet, and they try to obfuscate. These are all, I submit, directly related to the fact that this war and creating alliances and support for it is dwarfing, is suppressing any other consideration. And you know, the third world, the global south is paying, because now aid is only going to Ukraine, and there is very little amount of support that these people could count, and their debt is now costing so much because of the high inflation that is directly attributed to this war. The story that is really also quite obvious here, and my distinguished panelists has already covered these things, and usually it's not very easy to cover all the points that one would like, but strategically there tremendous interrelatedness between the war in Ukraine and what's happening, say, in Syria, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Iraq. There is no question about this relationship. It is more dangerous. The Americans and the Russians are face to face in Syria. The Americans have created bases, and they are a couple of kilometers away from where the Russians are. If the world is at the brink of a major confrontation, there is no pressure point, there is no powder keg that could be similar to what is potentially in Syria. And what we're really having here is a situation in which the US is not willing to even advance aid to the poor people who have suffered this catastrophic, as Dr. Mawa has been telling us, 50,000 people now are assumed to have been dead, hundreds of people, hundreds of thousands of people being wounded. The needs are dire. People are in real critical need for supplies, and this is the time when they have exacted these Caesar sanctions that prevent people from flying into Damascus to get the things. They have to go to Beirut, to go to Jordan, go to someplace else, thousands of kilometers away from where the people need them. And why? It's because of the sanctions. People cannot send money from here to Syria or to the people in Yemen or other places, or Lebanon, because there's so many sanctions, and many people are afraid to run afoul of these sanctions. They're imposing very human cost on lives, on livelihood, and on the ability of people to cope. What is really also truly here is that in the name of this war and creating the greatest support for it, and not getting into a position where countries would not be able to support. Israel has been exploiting this situation, playing both sides of the field, and being able to play this, it has exacted far greater cost on the Syrians, Lebanese, Palestinians, and their supporters. Just as the earthquake hit northeast Syria, they missile attack on Damascus itself, killing scores of civilian people. Why is this really going on? Why isn't anybody restraining the Israelis? The Russians are not giving the Syrians the kind of weather walls that they could defend themselves. The S-400 is given to Turkey, but not to Syria. All these things are basically and fundamentally gauged in a way that would not really upset the kind of relationship these superpowers really have with one another. The people who pay for these things, for the neglect and for the negligence and for the war crimes that have been committed against the poor civilian and the poor people of Palestine, Yemen, Lebanon, and Syria is basically fundamentally umbilically connected to this war in Ukraine. And the longer it goes, the more the difficulties and the greater the risk and the more the pain and the sacrifices of the people who could possibly would deal with it in any good way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Atif. Thank you for that global perspective, that economic perspective, and weaving things together as we had hoped. And you'll get a chance to do that more in the upcoming question and answer period. By the way, as I mentioned before, we have a very feisty audience. There's already 41 questions that have been submitted to the question and answer. Some of them are technical questions. Of course, I just want to remind you, especially for those who came in a bit late, yes, there is a dedicated question and answer period coming up shortly. We're going to be taking from the Q&A. We're going to be amalgamating some questions to save time. We'll be taking some questions from chat as they pop up and so forth, and you'll be able to chat with one another as well. So that will be happening in the not too distant future. And yes, this webinar format is a bit different than what we usually do. So this may be new to some individuals. It's my understanding, yes, what's coming up next is how you can find out about the criticality of the sanctions being addressed to Syria in particular. You've heard some things about that already, but also what can be done, what people are organizing and self-organizing at the grassroots level and in cooperation to actually get aid, including from North America, into Syria, into all of Syria, into as much of Syria as possible. And so to do that for us, we have Dr. Paul LaRudy, and he is a former associate professor of linguistics who also served as a Fulbright lecturer and a U.S. government technical advisor. In 2007, he co-founded a nonprofit human rights and humanitarian aid corporation, of which he is currently the chairperson and which provides fiscal sponsorship to other organizations, including the Syria Support Movement, of which Rick Sterling is also on the steering committee. So let's go over now to Paul LaRudy.
Thank you, Brendan. I'm very pleased to be in this excellent group and this wonderful webinar that is so informative. I think it's possible to say in brief that in terms of the earthquake was a great natural disaster that wreaked havoc and killed, as I understand, somewhere around 50,000 people altogether, and many more were injured, and more than that were made homeless. So this is amazing in terms of its disastrous consequences. So it's a great natural disaster, but the sanctions are a great unnatural disaster. And I really am uncertain whether the sanctions have created more death and more destruction and more misery to thousands, even millions of people, in 40 countries, as Rick has pointed out. And I'm highlighting Syria for a very special reason. The sanctions, of course, targeted countries like Russia and Venezuela and so many others. But there's a big difference in the case of Syria. Russia was able to recover because it was able to find other markets for its products and resources. Iran is not, it's harder for Iran, but Iran is changing its economy, and it is also exporting, and it's making arrangements with China and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so forth. Syria is special because it would like to do what Russia is doing and exporting its products to places that will take it, not necessarily the United States. But those products are in the hands of the United States. The United States has sent its military to occupy its oil fields and to rob Syria of its oil, and even of its wheat, which is the second largest export that that Syria has, and so Syria has been devastated economically, and hundreds of people die every winter because they don't have fuel to heat their houses, and many don't have houses to live in. It's been destroyed by the war. So it's in a really terrible situation. Syria is a special case, but all of these countries deserve some kind of help. Now, there are scores of organizations that are mobilizing to accept funds and to distribute aid for the earthquake. But watch out, please. They claim to, some of them are helping only Turkey, and Turkey gets most of the publicity with regard to it. That's fine, Turkey needs help. Syria gets less publicity, and there are many organizations that don't operate in Turkey at all. Those who claim to operate in Turkey, either only, I mean in Syria, those who claim to operate in Syria usually, unfortunately, operate only in the area that is controlled by the terrorist groups that the United States has been supporting against the government of Syria. And that's only 3% of the land area of Syria. It's a small proportion of the population. It's somewhere around 10% of the population. So when they say they're operating in Syria, they say that they're operating, they're actually only operating in a very small area of Syria, which is occupied by the terrorists, in many of whom are not even Syrian. And so the ones that operate in the government areas of Syria are very few. And you can say, for all the ones that you're likely to hear of, the only ones that are operating in the government areas, which are the much bigger areas of Syria, these are the United Nations organizations, which operate in the government areas of Syria, in the non-government areas of Syria, and in Turkey, of course. They operate wherever the disaster is taking place. The Syria Support Movement is the only organization at present that I know of that is actually operating in the government areas of Syria. We don't help we don't operate in the non-government areas, and we don't operate in Turkey. But let's face it, the government areas are being neglected, and they desperately need, the people of Syria need the help there. And we do something that other organizations don't do, because we're not afraid of what it is. The sanctions that the United States have imposed on other countries have the provision that is unused, which says that humanitarian aid is an exception. But most countries don't help with humanitarian aid, because in order to get the aid there, they have to go through Syrian banks, and that's forbidden under the sanctions. And they have to, the only way they can distribute the aid is through Syrian organizations, and that's also forbidden. So what we do instead is we created our own organization in Syria, and of course we can't use the banks. But Syrians have their own financial institutions. The question is, how do you get the funds to those institutions? As of the latest instructions from the Office of Foreign Assets Control in the United States, they have issued what's called General License 23. And that says anything that's for the earthquake, we have no sanctions. The sanctions don't apply. These are nice words, but what's the consequence? As Marwa has pointed out, the consequence is essentially zero. Nobody is, and the reason is because most organizations over comply with the sanctions. They don't want to do anything that would appear to be breaking sanctions. So in the case of sending money to Syria, there are no banks that are ready to jump on board and to use General License 23 in order to restore banking relations with Syria. Nobody's going to do that. There are risks involved. They don't know whether the money is going to be used for earthquake relief, for example. So it's not going to happen. And so in this sense, all the nice words of General License 23 are useless. It's not helping anything. And the exemption that in all the sanctions regulations, the exemption for humanitarian aid, nobody can do it because they have to go through banks and all these other institutions. So we have made a special effort at the Syria Support Movement to find ways to get money to Syrian organizations. I mean, it's now authorized by OFAC General License 23. So why not take advantage of it? Our view towards these regulations is, let's take advantage of what they claim to offer. Let's take advantage of our supposed right to deliver humanitarian aid. Let's follow the regulations and get the humanitarian aid there. So that's what we're doing. We're having to go through other countries, use other mechanisms, but we still have our nonprofit status in the United States. Donations are tax deductible to us, and those donations right now, any donation without having to specify it, we're sending it to Syria. It's not much. It's still not much. It's not like we're getting anything close to what the other organizations are getting. But whatever is sent to us, we will get it to Syrian organizations that are working to alleviate to help the victims of the earthquake. So anyone who wants to send donations for that purpose, we're very happy to get them where they need to go. And it's very simple. Just go to aidtosyrians.org. and then to the donate page. I mean, it talks about our humanitarian work, and you can put it there. But we're very happy to receive any donations you would like, and any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And that was a lot of information. Good thing this is being saved on video, but you can go to the Syria Support Movement website to find more information about all of these things. And of course, if you want to donate to the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, you can do that through the button on the website, or send e-transfer to hcsw@cogeco, that's COGECO.ca. Now, I know we have a very powerful chat question period coming up. It looks the Q&A already has some 54 questions and queries posted, and we're very generous. I know that the event is scheduled to end at 2:30, but we're going to extend it by 15 minutes to 2:45 p.m. And by so doing, we hope we can address many more of your questions and such than we ordinarily would be able to do. So what's going to happen in short order is we're going to be activating all of our panelists' video and audio, and they're going to be available to take questions. I'm going to read some of the questions that have been sent to me from the Q&A period. And within the next 5 minutes, I'll be opening up chat as well, and people will be able to chat with one another and also submit questions and post articles and links and such in the chat section. So some of the questions are going to be amalgamated or put together in order to save time. When you're asking questions, of course, you are able to address it to a particular panelist if you like, which some people have done, or it can be addressed to anyone or to the general panel and so forth. And I believe I've had some questions streamed to me already. And what I want to do is I want to amalgamate some of them. It looks like there's a few questions, particularly about Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, and aid. I think what I should probably do is start with a question about Lebanon. And the reason for that is it has not been addressed as much as other countries and other issues in the presentations so far. And I think we have a brief one that has been addressed specifically to Marwa. And so this question is from Aaron. And the question is, Marwa, is the Lebanese resistance playing any role in Syrian reconstruction?
Syrian reconstruction, no, that's actually the job and the role of the Syrian government, because the Syrian government needs to basically sign the agreements with the companies, entities, or states that are willing to help with the construction, or that are willing to actually sell Syria what it needs, from machinery to equipment to actual any material to start the reconstruction. The resistance in Lebanon had a fair basically share in eliminating the Takfiri terrorism from Syria, because if they hadn't been part of that resistance movement, Lebanon would have been next. That's the first thing, to protect their own people, and second, to protect Syria, that has always been the protective backbone of the resistance in the region and the first and major help for the resistance in Lebanon. But after the earthquake, the resistance in Lebanon started and is still every 3 days sending convoys of aid and help to all of the stricken areas inside of Syria, as has also the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, as has, believe it or not, the Yemeni resistance Ansarullah also sent relief and aid through the Lebanese resistance as well. So even the sanctioned and sieged and blockaded Yemen helped Syria during these times, and we saw a lot of help coming from also regional countries that broke the sanctions before the US actually said that it is lifting the hoax of lifting sanctions, like Algeria and Jordan and the United Arab Emirates and Iraq and Iran. Iran, on the other hand, has been offering and has started actually in certain areas the reconstruction process alongside the Syrian government, because it's one of the very few states that actually don't care about sanctions and have been giving helping aid to Syria ever since. But the shock for some of us in the axis of resistance was China, that it is still backing up until now from starting the reconstruction process, because it had allocated more than $110 billion to start helping Syria with the reconstruction, but then it stopped after Caesar's Act. I don't know why they are complying with the US sanctions. They have their reasons that we don't understand, to be honest with you. But the Lebanese resistance, for that matter, will only be part of that reconstruction if it is asked by the Syrian government to do so. But in the meantime, Iran is actually doing that, and it's going slow, but it is happening.
Okay, thank you very much, Marwa. Now, I have opened up the chat. People are able to chat with one another, and panelists are able to be in the chat. We have some rules about the chat. We would just ask that people be respectful to one another, just simply, talk about issues and things of importance and not be disrespectful to one another. Otherwise, you may have to be warned or ejected from the chat or something, but hopefully that doesn't happen. So basically, there's a lot of questions to get to, and I think we have to give Marwa a bit of a break there, although she probably has a lot to say about the next question. This is a general question. It's from Anonymous, and it's not directed to any particular panelist, and it's kind of a broader question about Syria that I thought would be better to get into before we get into some specific questions. So the question is from Anonymous, and the question is, I know Israel was a partner in crime to the Western and Gulf state war on Syria, but why has Israel been bombing Syria every other day of the week? Why do they feel obligated to bomb Syria? And why do the United States and its allies have sanctions put in place in Syria? So I'd welcome any panelist. It looks like Atif is raising his hand, so maybe he gets to go first to go ahead and answer.
Yeah, I mean, Israel did not feel obligated. It seems to be well motivated. And the reason for this is that Syria remains as one of the major states that have refused to kowtow to the Israeli designs and has remained loyal and committed and dedicated to support the Palestinian cause. And the Syrian with the resistance in Lebanon represent the only relevant and viable opposition or capacity to stand and to confront the Israeli expansionism and the major infractions of international law, international humanitarian law. So to a great extent, Syria is paying the price for its loyalty and for its commitment and for its actions and for remaining in the same trench, so to speak, in defense of Palestinian rights and Palestinian human rights and inalienable rights to self-government and to self-destination. To a great extent, Syria is being punished in a very systematic and cumulative way to degrade its power, to resist. As you know, Syria is not just only, protecting its neighbor. It itself is suffering occupation of Golan Heights. The Israelis are there and have made it a point and remain completely working on it, is to emasculate any power, any recovery, any strength, any capacity of Syria to re-establish its position and sovereignty over its land, its people. So the Israelis have really been, and to a great extent, they've been supporters of Nusra and all the jihadists that Dr. Marwa has talked about. So in many respects, Israel remains totally on the offensive towards any Arab resistance or any Arab capacity to protect itself and to present a helping hand to the Palestinians.
Okay, it looks like that question has been covered then. There's a couple of questions about Ukraine.
Can I say just one thing, Brendan? Is it possible to just say one thing about that?
Oh
I
yeah,
want
sure.
just to make clear. I want to make clear something that, first of all, in our region, especially the people who have suffered occupation, it's called the Zionist entity, the Zionist occupation. We don't actually accept the name Israel because it's called Palestine. That's number one. And that's basically one of the main factors of the conflict still going on in West Asia. Second of all, why is it okay to ask a question as to what is triggering Israel to bomb Damascus that is forming alliances to protect itself? And it's not okay to actually ask a question, why is it halal to have a NATO force, but haram to have a force in our region to protect us against any form of aggression or occupation or war? Why is it halal to have 82? When I say halal means it's okay, but it's the Arabic word for it. Why it's halal to have 82 countries bomb Syria for refusing to follow the demands of the United States of America, et al., but haram for Syria to have friends and alliances to protect it? Why is Hezbollah considered a terrorism after liberating and paying such a dire price to liberate its people? Only because it stood in the face of colonialism and imperialism and occupation. Hence why Israel is adamant on breaking any form of power that Syria is trying to reconstruct to make it way to liberate its land and protect the peoples from more aggression and more occupation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marwa. And yes, there had been some related questions as to whether the United States is still supporting ISIS and al-Qaeda in Syria. Maybe hopefully those have been answered by what the two panelists have said. Otherwise, we may come back to that. There are more questions about the politics in Syria. We have to get to Ukraine. First, there is a very helpful question that came early on that could be helpful to participants. So I want to get to that. And it relates to what Marwa and Paul and others have been saying. And it's about the fact that people want to help Syria and they're not sure what organizations they can utilize because the whole situation has become politicized, unfortunately. This is a big deal. People want to help, but they're not sure. And so there was a question from Anonymous, which is the Syrian American Medical Society, or SAMS Foundation, a good way to help Syria? What are some credible organizations to help Syria earthquake relief and in general? So I know our panelists seem to be eager to answer that. So
yeah, well, the Syrian American Medical Society is a society that was based in the United States, and it is the ones who exiled themselves from Syria as a result of trying to overthrow the government of Syria. So they're the enemies of most Syrians, and and the society, the medical services that they offer are to whom? They are to the so-called Syrian organizations, some of which are not even Syrian, that are the terrorist groups, the al-Qaeda affiliated groups that now occupy most of Idlib province, and where they provide medical services, not even to all the civilians in those areas, mainly to the terrorist fighters themselves and their families. That's it. They are basically the MASH services for the terrorist fighters that are supported by the US and NATO.
okay, I imagine then that the panel has been able to address that question. Just going through my notes here, there was a couple of questions concerning other parts of the world. Here we have a question about Ukraine, and that is a question from Aaron. And it is, does China's prospective involvement, its possible potential involvement in Ukraine, represent a potentially meaningful thrust against American activity in the region? And there's a related question, there's an from Anonymous, which is, what's been Israel's role in funding Ukraine war? And is there any complicity in the Nord Stream 2 bombing? So if panelists want to address either of those two questions, you can go ahead.
Well, I can address the question related to China. And China they abstain at the United Nations votes. At the same time, just the other day, they presented a 12-point proposal for peace in Ukraine. And at the same time, just almost simultaneous, they presented the Chinese Foreign Affairs Department issued a 6-page report titled something like U.S. hegemony and its perils, where they document U.S. hegemony in the economic realm, in the diplomatic realm, and the cultural realm, basically criticizing U.S. hegemony and attempts to dominate the world, which I was addressing earlier. So they're trying to find a solution in compliance with international law, and which will move the ball forward in Ukraine. And that's actually what Russia is seeking too. They're not, contrary to Western pundits, they've never sought to control all of Ukraine. They've never sought to control Kiev. What they are seeking is a neutral Ukraine that's not a threat to Russia, and to allow. And if Ukraine is going to continue its ultranationalist policies, they have argued that the people in the regions should have the right to secession, just as other people do. They had a vote in Quebec for secession from Canada. So they've done the same thing in Scotland, in the UK. In the Crimea, it was overwhelming. There was no question. I actually visited Crimea in 2016, and I saw on the ground, talking with all sorts of different people, because there's many ethnicities in Crimea. It was universal. They did not want to be part of the Ukraine government after the coup. So that was the breaking point, and that was directly caused by the U.S. And China is seeking a world where diplomacy instead of confrontation is the rule.
Thank you, Rick. There's a question about Syria and Palestine that I would like to get to, but first there is a direct question from Janet to Professor Caborsi. It's about the United Nations. So the question is, Dr. Caborsi, can you talk about the United States dominance in the United Nations, especially the Security Council, and how that works? Note that a Western pundit recently made a slip-up referring to the United States Security Council.
Yeah, I mean, that's a real interesting issue here. As you know, the United States is one of 5 countries that have the veto power. And you know that the Security Council, all its resolutions are binding, whereas the General Assembly, they are morally binding, but they are not legally binding. So the US used to be a lot more dominant in the UN. It contributed over 30% of its budget. Now it has been whittled down. Excuse me 1 second. I have to open the door 1 second.
We will let Dr. Caborsi have a pause on that question. But there's a question that other panelists may be able to address concerning Palestine and Syria. It's a question from Yuri. And the question is, can you speak to the deep divisions amongst Palestine justice folks and the Middle East, West Asian diaspora over Syria? I know, sadly, there were many Gulf-funded Palestine justice groups, anti-Islamophobia groups, who ended up supporting the Western Gulf War in Syria. So are there still divisions among West Asian folks in the diaspora over Syria? I guess the question is, what's happening in the Palestinian community or in the diaspora in terms of opinions on that conflict?
Do you think it would be best if Dr. Atif just finishes his idea and then we can talk about it, because it's extensive and it has changed over especially in the last year and a half?
Okay, that's completely understandable. So we'll let Atif, if he's available, finish the question concerning the United States and thinking of it as a United States Security Council.
Right. I mean, as you know, one of the major issues, one of the most stumbling issues of the UN is this veto power that these 5 countries that were the victors in the Second World War and continue to dominate the UN, and particularly the Security Council, because Security Council is like the cabinet, the government. The General Assembly is more like the parliament. So the action and the programs and the decisions of the Security Council, especially when it comes to war and peace and Chapter 7, are absolutely important. But the US is not alone. And as you know, one of the major casualties of this war is the reduced role of the UN. The UN, overall, the major mandate for the UN that represents what the UN is all about is to prevent Third World War. The League of Nations was replaced by the United Nations because it failed to avoid the Second World War. So there is a real challenge for the UN, and it is to the core and overarching mandate of the UN, and it's becoming a real problem. And the issue here is, to what extent can we change the way the UN works in such a way that no single country among the 5 permanent members that could basically paralyze and scuttle the UN. But the story that is quite important here is that we want to reform the UN in such a way that it would become more democratic, represents the majority of people. 80% of the people of the world are not happy about this war. And there is no way that the United States or anybody can now commandeer the UN in a position or in an action that is totally undemocratic, because it represents only a minority of the people of the world. The story here is, how can we reform the UN in such a way that no single permanent member can completely frustrate, thwart, and paralyze and derail the UN? But to what extent can we rebuild it, reconstitute it in a way that represents the majority of the people of the world?
Mhm.
Very, very good. And Rick is giving you the thumbs up and clapping. So great. Now, I suppose we can return to the question of the issue of Syria and the Syrian conflict within the Palestinian diaspora, Palestinian community. I know Marwa had started to answer that question. So if you like, yeah, we can resume that.
Well, it's really not that complicated, because, as you know, the resistance factions in Palestine, they are vast, and they are funded by a lot of friends across the world, especially in the region of West Asia. And each of them, sadly, is basically under the, not to say command, but they would like not to make their patronage like angry. Okay, what I mean by saying that, for example, the resistance in Lebanon and the Islamic Republic of Iran have been openly helping a lot of the Palestinian factions in Palestine, most notably the Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip, for example. Meanwhile, the Hamas movement has been directly funded and helped, despite the fact that they also receive funds and help and know-how and weapons from the resistance axis. They also receive funds from Qatar and Turkey as part of the Muslim Brotherhood political Islam. I don't like to say it's an Islamic, it's a political part of an Islamic movement. But during the first few years, or the majority of the war on Syria, Hamas had a very, not to say dishonorable position, let us not go there and say they had a conflicting feeling about what was going on inside of Syria. And they made a few statements that later on they explained that were not true, that they were not seen clearly. And that is what happened when Syria basically eliminated the direct threat of takfirism on its land. And we saw them making official trips to Syria and visiting Syria, and even visiting the President Assad as well. But that happened after severe mediation from both Hezbollah and the Islamic Republic of Iran, because we need to be united. So before 2021, yes, we could have said that the diaspora and even some of the Palestinian factions were, not to say on the wrong side of the war here, but they were at some point confused, and they were used by some of the regimes in the world that were seeking regime change inside of Syria, Western regimes, I mean. And after that, it was clear to them who still supports them, who still stands with them. And that was made clear for them, especially in 2020 and 2021 in the Sword of Al-Quds operation, where they saw clearly who was standing with them, who was supporting them, who said that we are ready to open borders and start firing at the Zionist entity. On the other hand, who was actually condemning this act of resistance and this act of self-defense by the Palestinian people. So yes, it was a bit of a gray area before 2021, but later on, right now, it is the resistance axis is at the heights of its coordination, and that is actually what's freaking out the Zionist entity inside of its own territory right now. The level of coordination and the level of cooperation between the different factions of the resistance axis, to a point that if something happens in Palestine, we have Yemenis threatening to start firing at the Israeli entities. It's that much deep coordination. So right now, there's no more conflicting reports. There's no more conflicting sides. Alhamdulillah, thankfully. But before that, it was a bit of a gray area, and we'd like to move forward. We'd like to be united. We like to not a lot touch upon it, but it happened.
See, there is one point that's very crucial here. The Palestinians in Palestine, and particularly in diaspora, are totally frustrated by Western hypocrisy. How could on earth people stand and condemn Russia for what they have done and refuse to condemn Israel, that has really continued to occupy and to pillage and to suppress and to dispossess the people of Palestine? Not even a whimper. And yet, you know, for everything that the Russians presumably has done, Israel has done in excess, and nobody is standing up and trying to draw the parallels. And this has frustrated us and many of the Palestinians, that this Western world speaks from two sides of its mouth, and it's a one-eyed judge and unable to see in a very objective and consistent way what are the trespasses and what are the infractions that these powers are committing.
Yes, it's all starting to come together. And so thanks, Marwa and Atif, on that. Before we get into a gigantic question, there's a question, part of weaving this together. I wanted to have a shorter question just about getting aid to Syria once again, because there was some discussion in the chat, and there was a question about the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, I believe. The question was, you know, if we want to help get aid into Syria, is the Red Crescent an organization that can be relied upon? So perhaps one of the SSM people want to take that.
Yeah, I can take that. The Syrian organizations are just doing phenomenal work on the ground there. It's amazing the work that they're doing. And the Syrian Arab Red Crescent is kind of the main one that has always been the one to help. And they have actually they have bank accounts outside Syria, in Lebanon. I know. I don't have the information, but probably it's available online. Anyway, we are planning to be using that to send aid to the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, which ordinarily prior to General License 23, we would not do, because only General License 23 says that the sanctions are suspended. The provision, all the provisions of the sanctions are suspended in the case of getting aid for earthquake relief. And so we're taking that quite literally, and we're donating money directly to Syrian organizations, which is in violation of the original sanctions against Syria. And we're ready to do that, but not everybody is willing to do that. I think we were the only ones willing to do that, actually. But we have a lawyer who's ready to defend us, and he's won against the US government in the past, so we have confidence in him. And so the banks are afraid to open relations with Syrian banks. The relief agencies, the charitable societies are afraid to associate with Syria. Never mind what General License 23 says, or what even what the original sanctions say. They're not ready to do that. If you like, it's time for others to emulate what we're doing. We're a tiny organization. We're not going to be able to do a lot, but others need to emulate what we're doing. We're taking the regulations and General License 23 at their word, that the United States does permit humanitarian aid with certain regulations as to how it's going to be administered. Let's do it. We're doing it now.
Great. Yes. Thanks very much, Paul. And I agree. And I think many do. Just before this, of course, people were weaving together issues about Syria, Iran, Palestine, and other things, the United States, Israel, hegemony. So there was a question that came to me that kind of puts a lot of this together, which is, and it's from an anonymous person in the Q&A, we are seeing an acceleration of de-dollarization in the global South as countries begin to trade more in their own currencies rather than in the US dollar. What effect will that have on other countries in West Asia struggling against US imperialism and intervention in their territories? Atif, I think you're muted. We could unmute Atif there.
Sorry, I say it's an economic question. I presume it's directed towards me, but I would welcome my colleagues to help. The US dollar use has come down significantly. Just a decade ago, 70% of the international reserves of central banks were in US dollars. Today is 59%, and many feel that it will continue to decline. There is now alternative currencies and programs where people felt that the hegemony of the US is very closely tied to the use of the dollar, because every $10,000 you transact, no matter where, it has to be okayed and reported to the Federal Reserve System. And many feel that the US holds literally veto power on international trade and on international transaction. And as you can tell easily, the first thing the US has done as a penalty to the Russians in this war is to throw them out of SWIFT. And this is not really something that the US should really have, that unilateral power to bring people into a payment system or out. This is injurious to the international trading system, and for a country that espouses and pretends to be for free trade, it's a major violator of free trade, and trying to use trade and the dollar as an instrument of the empire to continue its hegemony and its control of other countries and of economic developments in the parts of the world. The US dollar is increasingly being replaced and a large number of programs. As you know, the BRICS are trying to find a way in which they would not use the dollars. Even the Saudis, who are really always playing in cahoots with the Americans, have now decided to accept another currency in payment for oil. The fact that oil was only transacted in dollar was a major support for the American to remain in this hegemonic economic position. So increasingly, and I would predict that this number, 59%, is too high and is likely to be whittled down. And it would be to the best interest of the world, because the US dollar is not only a political instrument, but also a very expensive one. And quite often, there is something called seigniorage right, like it costs a cent to print $100, but it buys $100 worth. At one time, de Gaulle was really saying, look, if we want to trade with the Americans, we have to give our perfume, our fur, and our fantastic cheese, and all we get is paper. And he was really absolutely concerned about this. And to a great extent, people are really worried about that fact that the US is the largest indebted countries in the world, because it keeps printing money, and other people are persuaded or arm twisting are accepting it. Anytime you use the US dollar outside the US, you are giving an interest free to the Americans. You're giving them economic power to dictate to you and to the rest of the world the interest of multinationals. I don't want to say multinational, transnationals, in literally increasing their capacity to dispossess the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
I would also like to say that he said, how would West Asia be affected? People need to know that the system of capitalism that the US was adamant on imposing on states, for example, like Lebanon, like Jordan, like Iraq, we don't have any control over the banking systems in our countries. For example, you could see how Lebanon since 2018 has just nosedived economically and financially, and how more than 60 billion US dollars just vanished from the bank accounts of the depositors in Lebanon. It is a devastation. People who have pension money have lost its value. People who have actually invested in banks because they were giving high interest rates as high as 17%. Which is not found anywhere else in the world, to be honest with you, which was a big scam. We tried to inform the people it was a scam, but when it's near free money, people are not going to listen to you. But at the end of the day, they lost most of their savings, they lost their pension money, they lost their hardworking earned dollar at the end of the day. So it's not really that easy for us to free ourselves and to use a new currency unless we free ourselves from the current financial system that our countries are obliged to work with. For example, in Lebanon, who are you not allowed to criticize? We have more than four, we have more than four court orders to arrest the head of the central bank in Lebanon, who actually orchestrated this disastrous and engineered this disastrous system in Lebanon. And he's still making decisions and issuing statements and memorandums from the central bank, controlling the lives of the Lebanese people. And he is said to be a red line by none other than the US ambassador in Lebanon. So it's not that easy, but it's always the first step. It's very important to start with that step. And I think on and on, we can actually liberate ourselves from that system. But Lebanon has been hit very much with that. Added to the sanctions, it's causing just disaster at the economic and the social level in Lebanon.
Wow, a lot of enthusiastic questions and commentary. It's almost time to wrap up. We won't be able to take many more questions, and I know people are going to start leaving soon. But before we do that, I understand that Lolwa Al-Kasawat, one of the Syrian-Canadian organizers of the recent successful protest against Canadian sanctions in Mississauga, had put a comment there in the chat. So I just wanted to read that out. Lolwa has been on the radio recently. She's been on the Taylor Report on CIUT. I believe the Syrian community has been active in Mississauga Toronto. So Lolua says, thank you to all the panelists for this effort to shed light on the current situation, especially on the plight of Syria. I would like to invite you to extend your efforts to fight sanctions on Syria and prove the non-legality of sanctions that kill common people and don't affect governments. There will be a global protest beginning March the 4th, that will be a series of organized global protests by the Jordanian Stop the Sanctions on Syria movement. I can share the poster when it is received. I urge you to spread this movement and endorse it and be part of the movement so that we are unified globally against these illegal sanctions worldwide. Now is the time to stand against oppression, now that more and more countries are beginning to defy the Western imposed sanctions and to speak up against inhumane actions on innocent people. So thank you very much, Lolua, for that. And yes, if people want to get in touch with the events that are happening, get on our email list, go to the Contact Us section on the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War website, hcsw.ca. Email us to learn more at hcsw@cogeco.ca. That's hcsw@cogeco.ca. We'll get you in touch with Lolua. We'll get you in touch with the Syrian community in Mississauga and Toronto if you're someone that can come to take part in these events and help end sanctions. So on that note, there was a couple of related questions we can maybe burn through before 3 o'clock on the issue of Syria in particular. Question from Anonymous. Are the Gulf states with United States and Canadian backing still supporting ISIS and the other similar groups in efforts to oust the Ba'athist government? And the related question from another Anonymous, which is, can the panelists please speak about the white helmets, who they are, and their relationship with Al-Qaeda? So anyone who wants to pitch in on those related subjects, I encourage you to go ahead.
I'll let Marwa do the first one. The second one, I'll do the first one.
Let us start by saying it's called the Syrian government. It's not called the Ba'athist government. Stop using the terminology that is being fed to you by the Western mainstream media, for the love of God. That's number one. Number two, it's yes, I was watching a video with my husband just 2 days ago of how a big US helicopter that is funded by US tax money landed in Syria and made way for more than 22 motorcycles, on board of which were ISIS members. Yes, but you call them ISIS, I call them Daesh, but they are mercenaries being trained, funded, and armed by the United States of America. They landed in a certain area in Syria. They led them out with their motorcycles, and 2 days later, we had one terrorist attack in Tadmor and another terrorist attack in Hama. People were hunting for truffle in the fields, and they were gunned down from close points by Daesh, who was eliminated by the Syrian Arab Army and its allies. So yes, they are still funding them. There is a big military base in the 10th area, which is the triangle between Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. There's a big military base with a 50-kilometer radius where no one can actually go there or approach it or go near it or fly a drone over it. We don't know what's there, but we actually do know what's there. It's a US military base that houses the main base for Daesh terrorists, who are mercenaries, just like Blackwater is a mercenary of the United States of America. And they are still trying to wreak havoc and kill Syrians and try to take that control back from the Syrian government. So yes, they are still supporting, despite the fact that we have some Persian Gulf Arab states trying to reopen relations with Syria, for example, like the UAE and not Qatar, but the UAE and Oman, and at some point Bahrain as well. But despite that, they are still betting on wreaking havoc in Syria to try and gain some political gains from there when the dialogue is set to kickstart. So yes, money is still being dropped at terrorists in Syria to wreak havoc in Syria.
I don't make much difference between ISIS, Nusra, Qasad, and all the others. Actually, it's difference in degree, not in kind. And all these are supported and bankrolled by different groups, but particularly the Gulf countries and the Israelis. And the Americans, if they care to admit it, but as Marwa was really showing, you know, the two are literally in cahoots and working together and have been working for the past 11, 12 years. And they have not given up, despite the fact that there is now major improvement on the ground and expansion of the Syrian government control. But as one of the consequences of this, unified trenches, I call it, that the Americans are helping the Ukrainians to bleed the Russians and to, impose and continue to promote the American hegemony and expand it really eastward and northward. This is the same thing. The Americans are sitting on the oil and on the most fertile land that would feed the Syrians, basically trying to garner a position that they can dictate the future emerging order that would come. And this absolutely designed basically to bleed the Russians more, get them more embroiled, get them more engaged, and literally part of the chess game that we're talking about, in the sense that you cannot, maybe physically, geographically, the two battles are separate, but strategically they have a unified thread that combines and unites them both.
Yeah, ISIS fighters have recently gone to Ukraine as well. There's a photo of one with the ISIS badge with the Ukrainian forces alongside the Azov battalion. And so the U.S. is doing what it's always done. It's cultivating, it's training, it's equipping terrorists to use to its political advantage. One thing I'll mention is there's almost an unlimited amount of hypocrisy and cruelty in the U.S. policy. They don't want to end the Syrian war. They don't want to allow Syria to rebuild and recover and the Syrian people to be able to live again. 3 hours of electricity a day, that's what they're restricted to in Syria right now. Just try it. And the same thing applies to the Ukraine conflict. Soon after Russia intervened in February, just a week or two after that, Hillary Clinton was televised saying the model is Afghanistan. What she's referring to is the jihadi conflict that was promoted in Afghanistan to draw in the Soviet troops and to weaken it. So the U.S. they want to protract and prolong the Ukraine conflict. They want to do the same thing in Syria. And that's why we need to stop it. I think there have been excellent points made, and the tide is definitely going away from the U.S. U.S. hegemony in the economic sphere, control of capital around the world. Those days are gone, and it's going to be to the advantage of not only the people in Syria and Ukraine and Russia and elsewhere. It's going to be to the advantage of the North American people in the U.S. and Canada as well, because we're not benefiting from this, these horrendous policies of war, aggression, conflict, and pretending that the White Helmets were started by a British mercenary. And it's primarily a propaganda tool to demonize the Syrian government and to channel money from United Nations organizations into the terrorists. So there have been many articles written about the White Helmets exposing what a fraud they are.
In Syria and the region.
Yeah, I would add to what Rick said. You can search what Vanessa Beeley and Ava Bartlett wrote extensively about the White Helmets. You can find it, just Google it and you'll find it. But make sure to find websites that clearly archive where white helmets are wearing civil defense costumes, and the picture next to it, the same person holding weapons, killing civilians, and at some point, I'm sorry to say, but at some point executing a 13-year-old kid. Those are the white helmets. Vanessa, Billy, Eva Bartlett are to go-to journalists to know more about them.
As far as U.S. involvement in this is concerned, locally in both Syria and the region, and perhaps more widely, the CIA, which has more than 100 aircraft in the region and elsewhere, is known as Daesh Air. It's known as the air transport for ISIS terrorists to take terrorists from Syria to Afghanistan and to Ukraine, wherever the shock troops are needed. That's what the United States does. It takes whoever the proxy fighters, mercenary fighters, and it takes them wherever they want to. And no American young men have to come back in body bags.
Right. Well, I think our panelists have integrated it all very well. And you've actually managed to answer some of the outstanding questions that I had not yet had time to read. So I thank you very much. I'm going to want to I'm going to wrap things up at this point. We've covered a large part of the questions. I want to thank the audience for being so engaged and for asking questions since the very beginning and all the way through, and then entering the chat. I recommend people look through the chat for the mentions of various anti-war demonstrations. I think Joe Lombardo posted one example of that for March 18 or so. There's going to be other organizations, other groups all across North America continuing activity for the next month at least on anti-war activities. I encourage everyone to go out to these things in their local areas. We want all the events to be as big and successful as possible. So please work together on that. Join with the Syrian community in Mississauga, and you can contact us in the coalition to get information on that. Support the Syria Solidarity Movement and any organizations that are getting aid into all of Syria. So I want to thank again our sponsoring organizations today, the SSM, the Syria Support Movement, the Sanctions Kill, the International Manifesto Group, and the Geopolitical Economy Research Group, especially for lending us some of the equipment for this particular meeting. So thanks very much. Tune in for future events. We're going to give you as much as we can in terms of Rick Sterling's article and other information that people were requesting. We'll do a send out. We'll give you the video of this and everything of that nature. Thanks so much to our technical coordinator and our question assistant, people working behind the scenes to get questions to me and have things running smoothly. And you made this event successful. So thanks so much. And I guess we can all wave goodbye. And yes, you'll be hearing more from us and seeing more from these panelists. So thanks very much. And we'll be in touch.
Thank you.